Alternative formats for this presentation can be found on the Financial Services website. For assistance, visit or contact us. Email us at finance.training@queensu.ca or give us a call at 613-533-2050. Welcome to Research Overhead, Understanding the Basics. Research overhead, also known as indirect costs, refers to the cost of supporting the research environment beyond the direct costs charged to the project. Direct costs to conduct research are expenses such as salaries and benefits for personnel working on the research supplies, or travel. Overhead, or indirect costs, are costs such as utilities, services provided by HR, financial services, or ITS. These costs cannot be charged directly to the research project. However, they are required costs to the university in support of the research enterprise. While some research funding includes an amount to fund overhead, many projects do not. The amount of the research overhead funding varies depending on the funding source. While some funding agencies provide a specific overhead rate, rates may also be determined through the negotiation of research agreements and contracts. The indirect costs of sponsored research policy governs the establishment of overhead rates. There are two components to the overhead process: the overhead charge and the distribution of the overhead revenue. First, we will discuss the overhead charge. For research projects, which include an overhead component, overhead is expensed to the project on a monthly basis as direct costs are charged. This is completed through a process administered by research accounting. At the end of each fiscal month, overhead is charged based on the research expenses incurred within the month at the applicable overhead rate. Overhead expenses, if applicable, will appear against account 693001. For example, if the overhead rate for a given project is 40% on all direct costs and $10,000 in direct costs were incurred in the month, a $4,000 overhead expense would be charged to the research project against account 693001 at the end of that month. Have you ever wondered what the overhead commitment is on your research project statement? Overhead commitments represent funds budgeted to pay for future overhead expenses. Overhead commitments are recalculated at the end of each fiscal month as overhead is expensed. Committing future overhead expenses reduces the available balance in the project, which helps provide researchers with a more accurate view of funds available for the direct costs of research. The overhead commitment amount is calculated by subtracting total overhead expenses to date from the budgeted overhead amount for a given project. For example, if a project included an overhead budget amount of $10,000 and $3,000 in overhead expenses has been charged to date, the research project statement would reflect an overhead commitment amount of $7,000. Research projects do not always include an overhead component. To determine if your project includes overhead, you can refer to the budget details. If a budgeted amount exists next to account 693000, this indicates the project will be charged overhead. If you become aware that your project budget has changed and your project involves overhead, please contact Research Accounting, as the budget change could impact the overhead commitment amount. We will now discuss the second component of the overhead process, which involves the distribution of the overhead revenue created by the initial overhead charge. Immediately following the overhead charge process, Research Accounting will then distribute the same amount that was charged as overhead revenue. Overhead revenue is distributed using account 480002, Restricted Revenue Overhead Research. Overhead revenue is typically distributed to the faculty or school the principal investigator is affiliated with. In some cases, a negotiated percentage of overhead may also be distributed to the affiliated hospitals. To request an exception to the overhead distribution, an exception form must be completed and approved. This form can be found on the TRAC website. When recoding expenses, it is important to consider the effects of overhead, if applicable. In order to better understand this concept, we will now review an example in more detail. Let us consider a project which has received revenue totaling $5,000 and has incurred expenses to date totaling $4,000. This would result in an available cash balance of $1,000. In this case, additional expenses have been identified as being eligible to be charged to this project in order to fully spend the funds. We will assume a 40% overhead rate applies to all direct expenses within the project. In order to determine the appropriate amount of expenses to be recoded, you must first take the available cash balance of $1,000 and divide this amount by 1.4, given the overhead rate of 40%. The result of this calculation is $714.28, which represents the direct expenses that can be charged or debited to the project. Once the overhead process is administered at the end of the month, overhead will be charged to the project at a rate of 40%. If we take the $714.28 in expenses which were recoded to the project and multiply this figure by 40%, this will result in an overhead charge of $285.72. Therefore, to sum up, we assumed an initial cash balance of $1,000. Once expenses totaling $714.28 are charged to the project, and a subsequent overhead charge of $285.72 is expensed, the project will have been brought to a zero balance and can then be closed. If you require additional details regarding the indirect costs of sponsored research policy, please visit the Policies page on the University Secretariat and Legal Counsel website. How may we help you today? If you have questions, give us a call at 613-533-2050. Our fax number is 613-533-6433. Email us at finance@queensu.ca or visit the Financial Services website. We are located at 207 Stewart Street, 3rd floor in the Rideau Building. Our hours of operation are Monday to Friday from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. This concludes our tutorial. To learn more or to review additional training resources and video tutorials, visit the Financial Services training page.